Welcome everyone to another Noyo Center Science Talk. And thanks for taking your evening to be with us here and to learn some more awesome ocean science with another fabulous guest. We had scheduled Jack earlier in the spring, but he got called to duty and apologized profusely. And I said, no, we're just glad you're out there trying to disentangle a whale down in the Bay Area. So it's the kind of work that takes incredible training. These people are really brave and really careful and taking care not to injure themselves. And I just hats off to the people that are doing that work. And it sounds like it's just progressing on even further than what it was years ago, where it was just like, let's be badass and disentangle a whale. Then it became more about like, let's be badass and be careful not to hurt ourselves. And now at this next level, let's see what we can do to avoid it in the first place and learn, what the scars are and whatnot. And I'll definitely, I think, we'll turn it over to you momentarily, Jack. My beach survey team, we usually meet this evening, and initially I was going to have you just come talk to my beach survey team, because what the beach survey team is doing is they're out there every 2 weeks on beaches from Westport down to Elk along the Mendocino coast. And they're doing a number of things. And at this point, I think they kind of wonder what they're doing and why. Hopefully they're enjoying the walks. What they're doing is reporting dead marine mammals, super important. And we're going to see how, if this changes the reports that are coming into the stranding hotline, to see if we actually get an uptick in reports now that we're doing this with regularity. We have had 4 reports of dead marine mammals that I received those reports from the beach survey people and no one else. So that is kind of proof in the pudding that it is working, to have people out there who are trained to really scan and look carefully for things that are on the beach that don't look quite right. And they're also doing a live mammal count. So certain places have a lookout and the beach survey team will give it 15 minutes and scan north and south and kind of count the pinnipeds on the rocks, report the whales. They've been reporting whales. So I've got that data. Super important when someone like Jack is going to be surveying the area. I can say, well, they saw gray whales on September 2nd off of Mendocino, or whatever the case may be. So that's really valuable. And the other part to the surveys, well, they count kelp, which is great. And we will contribute that data to Reef Check and see, we're seeing reproductive kelp and we're seeing little kelps and adult kelps. So super cool survey. And the other thing that they're doing is picking up trash. So picking up trash is obviously going to help our marine ecosystem tremendously. I've dragged massive big ropes off of the beach that wash in. It tends to happen more in the wintertime when gear washes in, and just dragging that off the beach or picking up a fan belt or a packing strap or a plastic bag, whatever it is, you're removing it from the beach. And therefore, it is no longer going to be in danger of entangling a whale or being eaten by a fish or a bird or whatever. So people have been removing not a ton of trash because there hasn't been a ton of trash, but we'll see the patterns there. If we get the wind events where a bunch of gear comes in from the ocean, things will change. So beach survey team, welcome and thank you so much for the work that you are doing. And welcome everyone else to the Noyo Center Science Talk. And we've been having them sporadically. Thank you, Wendy, for booking these speakers. And thank you to all the speakers who make it possible. Noyo Center loves to bring you these talks, and feel free to hit the donate button, or there isn't one really right here, but you can go to our website. And if you want to kick in $10 for the talk, that's great. It helps us out and empowers our little steam engine to keep on going. Without a doubt, every little bit helps. So Thank you. Thank you. Ready to bring you on, Jack. We'll let you share your screen and welcome and thank you once again.
Thanks for that intro, Sarah. And again, thanks everyone for coming tonight to listen to this science talk. I really appreciate it. I'm in my, as Sarah was saying, being on an entanglement response team is serious work and requires a lot of training and knowledge about whale behavior, marine boat operation, and working with lines under tension. And so it's very much an apprenticeship program. You need to do a lot of training before you can get into being a level 4 responder, which are the people who are permitted by NOAA to actually make cuts, to use the knives around whales and lead that disentanglement effort. So you need to put in a significant amount of time to work your way up to a level 4, usually about a decade of experience before you're given that sort of clearance. And so I'm in the second year of my apprenticeship program, which I started working with SR3. Not sure, can you see my mouse on the screen? It's over Moss Landing, great, okay. So I started my apprenticeship program working with SR3 as a member of their large whale entanglement response team. I was working under Doug Sandylands, who's one of the level 4 permitted entanglement responders for the United States. And I also worked with Jen Tackaberry, who was a level 4 responder from Cascadia Research Collective. And together, Jen, Doug, and I would run entanglement surveys off of Central California up to Washington, collecting population information about these whales, but also and mainly looking for active entanglements and being a fully fledged entanglement response team ready to help any whales that we came across. In addition to that, which is, it's sort of become background work almost now for me, is I'm a graduate student at Moss Landing Marine Labs. I'm in a master's degree program there where I study bioacoustics, and I work on a project that monitors soundscapes and national marine sanctuaries all along the coast. And I specifically am interested in baleen whale acoustics, and I'm focusing on patterns in humpback whale acoustics as they change along the West Coast. And so sort of all of my experiences have brought me to the point of wanting to be a large whale entanglement responder. And so part of what that means is being able to communicate with the public what large whale entanglement response is, why we do it, and why it's important. And so that's really what this presentation is going to be tonight. Typically this is the presentation that we give when people are entering or want to become a level 1 entanglement responder. And what a level 1 entanglement responder is that you are aware of who to call, what to report, and what to look for when you come across an entangled whale. And you're also knowledgeable about the sort of things to avoid when you're around an entangled whale as well, which is really, really important. It's just as important as knowing what to do is what not to do. And so this presentation will give a lot of background on what happens to entangled whales, why we should care about that, and all the amazing things that we've learned from concentrated research efforts. Sarah mentioned SCAR studies. There's also other types of studies that we look at, like where the gear came from and the gear wrap around the whale, which helps us learn a lot about where in the water column the whale became entangled in the line. But I'll talk more about that later. So you see all these other organizations here. These are just a few. These are the organizations that I've had the privilege to work with directly here on the West Coast, but it's just a few of the organizations that are involved in the West Coast Large Whale Entanglement Response Network. There's dozens and dozens of organizations that have folks from level 1, mostly up to level 3. There's only a few level 4 responders on the West Coast right now. But dozens of organizations have people who are interested in large whale entanglement and response. These are just the organizations that I've been able to work with. And just some disclaimers before we go. A lot of the images in this presentation are taken from the Center for Coastal Studies. That's where these techniques were developed and have been perfected. And that's where these tools are mainly tested before they're disseminated across the world to different entanglement teams in Australia and South Africa, off of Mexico. They all follow the protocols and use the tools that the Center for Coastal Studies designs in collaboration with the International Whaling Committee as well. And all the images and all the activities that you see have been done under the following NOAA permits. It's just to emphasize that this work, you need to be permitted to do this work because it is dangerous. So let's start. We'll talk about some impacts of entanglements on large whales. And as you can see, the impacts on large whales are often gruesome. the impacts of entanglements on large whales are often gruesome. For a whale that cannot free itself from an entanglement, and that entanglement is considered life-threatening, the average time to death is about 5 to 6 months. It varies based on sort of the entanglement configuration and where on the body it is and things like that. And there's often a range of things that end up causing the whale's death. But the main takeaway point is that it takes a long time for these animals to die. What's commonly people think that entangled whales are in jeopardy of drowning, and it's actually pretty rare that entangled whales drown. These creatures are enormous and incredibly strong, and it takes a lot of gear or really heavy chain or cable in the ocean to prevent these animals from being able to get back to the surface to take a breath. It does occur, though. It certainly does occur. Just in 2019, right outside of Nia Bay, off of Washington, a gray whale became entangled in gill net and couldn't get back to the surface, and it drowned. Long-term effects like starvation occur when a whale becomes entangled with gear in its mouth, or if a previous entanglement seriously causes damage to the whale's baleen, those plates that hang from its mouth so it can filter feed. Certainly any entanglements that occur in the mouth typically cause some serious damage either cause damage to the baleen or prevent the whale from actually capturing prey in general. Sometimes entanglements wrap both the top and the lower jaw of these baleen whales. And a key feature of baleen whales feeding is the ability to expand their throat, right, and take that huge gulp of water to then flush their prey out. If entangling gear is tightly across their pleats, essentially their throat, they can't expand their throat to feed, and it's a long, slow starvation to death because these animals, being migratory for a large portion of the year, they don't feed. They have these blubber stores, and so it takes a long time for a whale to starve to death. Chronic impacts like infection occur when line causes deep embedding, or over time line deeply embeds into the whale, and that deep wound becomes infected. That infection will kill the tissue, and that part of the whale slowly sort of dies as those tissues die and spread. And this image here is a gray whale that had a really tight fluke wrap around its flukes, and it was first reported in this condition. And this image was taken, and it shows when you watch, it was taken with a GoPro, and so it's video footage, and watching the video footage, you can tell that this tail fluke is completely necrotic and these cells have died, and it's essentially useless to this whale right now. This whale was freed, and then actually 8 days later, it washed up and had perished from its entanglement wounds. Another impact, or another chronic impact, is drag, and sort of drag and infection can sometimes be hand in hand. And drag is the added force of carrying all this gear through the water. So you can see this humpback whale here down on the bottom is dragging over 400 feet of line through the water, and that added friction as it pulls that gear and these two buoys here, which are those white trails at the surface there, it adds a ton of weight to that animal and forces it to exert so much, or a lot more extra energy. Additionally, as that line is pulling back, it's easier over time for that line to embed into the whale. But it's another chronic impact. And lastly, another common impact is traumatic injuries. And this was a North Atlantic right whale that became entangled, where it had an entanglement wrapped around its left pectoral flipper up over its back, and then wrapped around its right pectoral flipper. And it became entangled as a young whale. And at the time it was a young whale, it wasn't a life-threatening entanglement. But as this young whale grew and became bigger, that line slowly cut into its back over time as it grew. And eventually that line cut deeply into its organs, and it ended up bleeding out as its cause of death. So like I was saying, the average time to death for an entangled right whale, which has been studied pretty well, as they're critically endangered, and entanglements and ship strikes are a big factor for why they're critically endangered. 6 months is about the average time it takes a right whale to die. But like I was saying, there's a range. It's sometimes immediate in the drowning case, but it can take up to 2 years as well. Like I was saying, it really depends on the location of the entanglement and the severity of that entanglement as well. Sometimes an entanglement just loosely wrapped around a pectoral fin is non-life threatening, we would call it. And so there's sort of no risk to death there. But these two images are of two different whales, but it's sort of just to show what happens over time. This is the Fluke wrap entanglement, as we sort of commonly refer to it. In the top left, this humpback whale has probably been entangled for about a month, because you can tell this line is starting to bite down into the tail at the dorsal side of the peduncle there. You can see the line is starting to deeply embed. Over time, that embedding of the line is going to cut off blood flow and also allow infection to set in, and those cells will die, and it'll start to look like this caudal peduncle that's down bottom there. There's another humpback whale that had a fluke. There's also impacts to the reproductive success of animals. And if we're talking about the North Atlantic right whales and mentioning they're critically endangered, and entanglements are serious. Entanglements not only kill whales, but they prevent reproductively viable females from being able to give birth to healthy calves. Reproductive female right whales that did have severe entanglement wounds or were actively entangled had significantly longer periods in between giving birth than healthy females or females with just minor wounds. And this is because the energetic cost, like I was talking about with drag, the energetic cost of any entanglement or fighting off the infection from an injury caused by entanglement, it sucks away energy that this female could be devoting to raising a calf or preparing her body to give birth to a calf and then nurse it for a year. There was this one case back in 2010 where right whale 1140, known as Wart, showed up in Cape Cod Bay with this entanglement that she had picked up off of Florida, I believe. And Wart was disentangled with this cool technique of using a broadhead cutter, which is this X they're really small razor blades. They're less than a ½ inch long, but they're incredibly sharp, and they form this sort of X. And the crossbow bolt is fired at the line and cuts the line. It does cause a small cut to the whale, but comparatively, that small cut from the broadhead cutter is much less harmful to the animal than it continuing to swim with this entanglement. And so Wart was disentangled with this broadhead cutter. You can see in that image in the center, here's the broadhead cutter up in the top here, and it's flying towards Wart. It slices this line here, and then that entanglement was able to flow through her mouth and not damage her baleen. 3 years after she was disentangled, which is the typical calving interval for female right whales, she showed up in Cape Cod Bay with a calf. And so it's, pretty good evidence that disentangling her added one more animal to this critically endangered population. So now we'll talk a bit about the where, when, and in what do whales get entangled. And as you'll come to see, these are questions that we're still trying to understand ourselves, and that's why we're doing the research. Like Sarah mentioned with marine debris is a big problem, but especially for pinnipeds. There was this article that's cited down below, did a review of all entanglement sources for many different marine mammals and also other marine animals as well. And they found that pinnipeds in particular were susceptible to entanglements in marine debris, like these packing straps, like those 6-ring soda can holders, discarded ghost gear, or discarded fishing gear, or just destroyed fishing gear that's left in the ocean. Those were common sources for pinnipeds, and they were less common for large whales, although it does certainly happen. As you can see from this sei whale that was off of Massachusetts, it had exactly one of those packing straps wrapped around its rostrum. And I mentioned earlier, the difference between a life-threatening and a non-life-threatening entanglement. This sei whale's packing strap around its rostrum would be considered non-life-threatening, because that whale can continue to function and do its daily activities without exerting a significant amount of extra energy. And additionally, it's very likely to free itself. That packing strap is likely to come off the whale. We don't need to launch a team and put people in harm's way and also harass this whale to try to free it from that. On the right, though, is a humpback whale that was up off Vancouver Island that was entangled in active fishing gear. And so this is the most common source of entanglements for large whales, is active fishing gear. And what we mean by fishing gear is, or active gear is, pots or traps or gill nets or floating or drifting net that is set by fishermen for, a period of time, and then they come back looking to retrieve their gear and looking to retrieve their catch of crab or shrimp or fish or whatever it is they were trying to catch. Occasionally, though, they come back and their gear is gone, and that's because a large whale has become entangled in it and swum off. Although active fishing gear is the most common source, whales can become entangled and have become entangled in some pretty incredible things. This was a incredibly thick steel cable that a humpback whale became entangled in, or it showed up entangled in. It's off of Hawaii. And this cable, just to give you a sense of how thick and large this cable is, it's sitting on a pallet that's 5 feet by 5 feet. And so you can get a sense of just how thick and large and heavy that amount of cable must have been. And this cable was through the mouth several times and sort of bunched up on the whale's back, and it was having a really difficult time surfacing. And the normal disentanglement tools weren't sturdy enough to sort of cut through this. The knives were breaking or just not doing anything. And so they actually brought out multiple sets of bolt cutters and just started cutting through this cable, trying to get some of this weight off of this whale. The whale swam away with still a bit of cable wrapped around its top jaw, and it actually hasn't been seen since now. I checked again on Happy Whale to see if its flukes have been resighted since, but it hasn't now. So it's been nearly 4 years since that whale was resighted, and it typically tends to mean that it didn't survive the injuries and the exertion from having to deal with this entanglement, but it could show up again for sure. And so one of the main goals of the research that's different, some of those different organizations that I listed are trying to do, and the different working groups that are formed to address this issue. One of the things they've been trying to do is increase the consistency with which gear is marked in different parts or different areas along the West Coast, so that when entanglement responders do go out and free a whale, they can understand where that gear came from, and then where that whale may have become entangled, because it's often difficult to tease out where a whale became entangled just from a response and pulling that gear off. And so in 2014 was when collaboration along the entire US West Coast really came together, and the West Coast network was really started to form. And it was really perfect timing, because in 2015, 16, and 17, when that warm blob effect sort of came into really all along the California coast and really changed things up, it shifted the anchovy distribution, and humpback whales entanglements skyrocketed over those 3 years, 2015, 16, 17. They were record numbers of entanglements here on the West Coast. And so looking at the gear that was retrieved from the whales that were disentangled, we saw that about a third of that gear came from commercial Dungeness crab fisheries. About 20% of that gear came from various other fisheries, spiny lobster, sablefish, shrimp, and spot prawns. And including gill nets and drift nets was about 20%. Gill nets and drift nets, I think, were 12% of that 20. But the big scary gray blob here on the left, over 50%, 55% was unknown gear. Either the identifying features weren't on the gear that was retrieved, or it just wasn't. It was gear that wasn't marked. There's the designations for how commercial fishermen have to mark their gear are still being updated and changed in different areas, and some areas haven't even used them until recently. And there's been a push to get recreational fishermen to follow a similar sort of marking guideline, but it's a time-consuming and costly process, and sometimes it even causes fishermen to have to buy completely new gear to put the appropriate marks on it. So it's been sort of there's been challenges to getting uniform marking of gear along the West Coast, so that entanglement responders can try to identify where entanglements have been occurring. So we can, note the location of different reports though, and where we can report, where the report of a confirmed entanglement is what's shown on this map here from 1984 to 2018. I have a couple more years of data that I should add to this map. But as you can see from this, we get entanglement reports all along the US West Coast. And this is just using United States data. It's not to say that there actually are even a couple points down here along the entrance to the Sea of Cortez there. But this map is essentially just to show that along the entire habitat use of these large whales, we find entanglements. And from the gear marking that has happened in commercial fisheries, we have been able to tell that the sources of entanglements happen anywhere where whales and gear overlap. So on feeding grounds, whales have become entangled with this picture from the Vancouver Aquarium I showed you earlier up off Vancouver Island. Duke University has cataloged in their SPLASH study, which I'll talk about a little later on, cataloged a few entanglements along migratory routes, more offshore, and then breeding grounds in Rabin down off Mexico. They see whales becoming entangled as well. So really anywhere they overlap, they will become entangled. And one thing I just want to talk about this map is the distribution of points, right? It's pretty clear that a lot more entanglements have been reported in the central to Southern California region, those really dense clusters. And while it might suggest that there are more entanglements happening in this area, it's actually a factor of a larger reporting effort, in the Central California to Southern California region. And this reporting effort is essentially a combination of the number of people on the water who are aware that an entanglement hotline exists and that there are people they should report these entanglements to, and the ability of responders to actually go out and confirm that entanglement. Or it doesn't necessarily have to be an entanglement responder. Sometimes just a picture or video that's forwarded to responders can be used as confirmation of an entanglement. And so there's a master's student who was working with Cascadia, and I'm blanking on which university she was from, but she was essentially looking into this to tease out if this was a factor of difference in reporting effort, or if there were just more entanglements being seen down here. And her results seem that she's in the process of publishing, but her results suggest that it's a factor of difference in reporting effort. And so we've really focused on connecting with more people along the Oregon, Northern California, Washington coast to, spread the word about entanglements. And if they are on the water and come across an entangled whale, to know what to do in that sort of situation. Again, though, like I said, where a whale is seen entangled is very likely not where they became entangled. There was this instance of a humpback whale showing up off of Hawaii where it was disentangled by responders, and they used the identifying features that were on that commercial gear to trace it back to a commercial crabber out of Alaska. Over 2,400 miles away, this whale swam with gear on it. And there's actually been the opposite effect too, where whales have picked up gear in Hawaii and then swam north to Alaska and have been disentangled off of Alaska. And so these animals can travel tremendous distances carrying this gear. And that's why, uniform marking of gear, or just having a standard approach to how we mark gear, can really help us understand more about this problem. Then we can actually start to say, okay, this is where and when the whale became entangled, and start to understand how we can come up with some solutions to prevent this. So I've mentioned the East Coast a little bit, and I just want to talk a bit about the Atlantic Large Whale Disentanglement Network, because it has really become the model globally for how to try to deal with this entanglement issue. And so you can see on this map here, these yellow dots mark the locations of the first entanglement reports from 1999 to 2015. And the Center for Coastal Studies is located at this red dot right here on Cape Cod off of Massachusetts. The red dots represent response teams with a level 4 responder. There's certainly organizations in different parts along the coast that have level 3 responders, but level 3 responders are not permitted to use the knives to cut whales free. They can attach satellite tracking gear to the whale or to the entanglement gear so that entangled whale can actually be found and freed by a level 4 responder. But in, over those 20 years, they've had nearly 600 confirmed entanglement reports and over 300 successful disentanglements. I was actually looking at that data recently, and they had an over 50% success rate with disentangling whales over those 20 years, which is really, really incredible. It's been really challenging on the West Coast to get to these whales and actually free them. Sarah mentioned how this is actually the rescheduling of this presentation. I was going to give it back in the spring when we got a call of an entangled gray whale that was swimming around in San Francisco Bay. And anyone who's been on the water in San Francisco Bay, it's a pretty high traffic area. There's lots of people around. And so we were pretty confident that we would be able to find this whale and help it. We didn't have a standby vessel, which I'll talk about more. When a person calls a whale in, we ask a vessel to stand by to help us find it. And we didn't have a standby vessel, but we were still pretty confident we'd be able to find it. And we searched for 8 hours and we found it at like 4 p.m. Right as the winds were coming up, the swell was starting to pick up, conditions were going to get worse. So we didn't have much time, and we're getting prepared to mount our response to help this whale before the weather turns really crappy, and all of a sudden it just disappears. We had 3 boats out there. There was the boat I was on and 2 boats from the Marine Mammal Center, all of us monitoring this whale very closely, and it still managed to give us the slip. So it's incredibly difficult to successfully disentangle these whales, even when you have trained responders on call ready to go. And so I just want to emphasize that 50% success rate on the East Coast is incredible. And part of their success was the formal establishment of their network in 1996. In 96, the Center for Coastal Studies dedicated resources to building a response team and having them be on call, and not only on call and permitted to cut whales free, but also to give talks like this and to do outreach with the public and with fishermen and other people who were on the water to spread the word about entanglements and let people know there is a network that you can call these things into, and there's a team of trained people who will go out and help this animal. And you can see that after this network was established, the number of confirmed reports each year started to go up consistently, and it stayed really high, much higher than it was before the network. And sometimes it can be easy to think that this might be, just because of changing whale populations or changing fishery regulations or things like that, but it's almost certainly because there was concentrated effort put into doing outreach and education and formalizing a network. And so we've tried to do the same thing on the West Coast here. And this shows confirmed entanglement reports by species of whale each year. And as I mentioned, right around 2013, 2014 was the formation of the West Coast Large Whale Entanglement Response Network. Now, it certainly does look like after the formation of the network on the West Coast, our cases went up as well as folks started to do more outreach and stuff like that. But it's important to remember that, or it's important to make the note that in 2015 and 2016 were really anomalous conditions along the West Coast, as that warm blob effect really sort of changed up a lot of the biological oceanography happening along the coast, and whales moved into areas where there hadn't been previously, and there was a lot of gear. So those numbers were, the 2015 and 2016 were certainly anomalous, but we've had a higher average number of reports since the formation of the network than we did prior to that. The other sort of asterisk on this graph is the 2020 reports and the effect that COVID had on the reports coming into the network. And it's been sort of difficult to understand because in some areas of the West Coast, vessel traffic skyrocketed and people were on the water more than they had been before COVID, and boat sales skyrocketed as well. A lot of people were buying vessels for COVID, or to have something to do during COVID. But the number of reports that we were getting dropped significantly. And it's sort of, we think this is sort of a result of one of the keys here in our, this is our function that we use to sort of understand the number of reports that we get. And so this function is for number of reports is made up of 3 parts. First is the number of entangled whales that are actually out in the ocean, right? That changes, and we'll talk about more how we estimate that a little bit later. Another part of the function is the number of the potential observers that are on the water and have the knowledge of how to report and the willingness to report. The last part of the function is a functioning network able to receive reports. So the functioning network that is able to receive reports, that exists, and that's great. That part is not changing in this equation. The number of entangled whales is changing, but we know for a fact that we're only getting reports of a very small percentage of those entangled whales. We know that there's quite a bit more entangled whales than we're getting in our confirmed reports here. The estimates of the West Coast Entanglement Response Network is 5 to 10% of all entanglements that actually occur get reported. So if we take our, I think is 18 reports in 2020, that could be only 5 to 10% of the actual total number of reports that happened. And so what we try to understand is how this one changes. The number of potential observers that have the knowledge of how to report and the willingness to report any entanglements that they come across. These images that I added down here sort of show some of the different pitfalls that come into getting reports. On the left here, these 2 images are, we call them ad hoc responses. So people that found an entangled whale and took it upon themselves to try to free that animal. These were 2 cases that happened in 2018 that almost didn't get reported. They were, brought to the attention of the network essentially through like social media buzz and videos and images posted online, creating such a stir on social media that the right people happen to come across it and realize, hey, that's an entangled whale that needs to be reported to the network. This humpback whale that has a little bit of gill net coming off its fluke. This was an image taken by a whale watching boat off the coast of Washington. And at the time, they had no idea that they had documented an entangled whale. And they share their data with Cascadia's Research Collective. And folks going through the photos that had been submitted realized that an entangled whale had actually been photographed. And so that's another report that gets added into the system. And then lastly are whales that die out at sea and have their either die. You can see here these orange pill buoys that were wrapped around the fluke. This was a whale that died of its entanglement. It eventually sank, I believe, but essentially we don't know how many whales that die from their entanglements, never wash up on a beach. I'll show some images later on from stranded whales that wash up with entanglement injuries and the importance of stranding networks, being able to recognize entanglement injuries or entanglement, active entanglements that wash up. But trying to estimate how many whales that die from entanglement and never make it to the beach and never counted is another part of this function that we really don't know. And so it is all this to say, it's incredibly difficult to understand how the number of your reports actually relates to the number of entangled whales out in the ocean. One way that we look at the number of entangled whales that are out in the ocean is by understanding scar studies. We take photos of the tail stalk of, in this study, it was only humpback whales, but you can do it for other species of whale as well, just that humpbacks fluke pretty consistently. So you can take these photos of their tail stalks and compare how the same individual whale, how their tail stalk changes, on a yearly or monthly basis, whatever granularity you can get. This was a study done on the East Coast by Juke Robbins, who is the lead researcher at the Center for Coastal Studies for Humpback Studies. Excuse me. And she works on a population of about 1,000 whales that live in the Gulf of Maine that are incredibly well studied. They're pretty much all of them have names. All their flukes are known. Their parents are essentially known, and their age is very well known. And so studies like this, where you can tell how an individual's scarring rates have changed on a yearly basis, is only possible to do in a population of whales like that. And so from 2003 to 2006, Juke used Duke used a whole bunch of images to look at how scarring on individual whales changed. What she found using her over 2,000 pictures was that about 70% of the Gulf of Maine humpback whales had entanglement scars. So 700 of those 1,000 whales at one time in their life had been entangled. Over the 3-year period that she looked, there was a range of 10 to 25% of new entanglement wounds each year. So in one given year, 1/4 of the population could become entangled. And there was an estimated 2 to 4% annual mortality in this specific population of humpback whales, which is very, very significant when 4%, possibly 4% of your population is dying from entanglements alone in one given year. It's a serious cause for concern. So on the West Coast, we've tried to take a similar approach and look at how our populations of whales are changing, or I should say how their scars are changing. And so Cascadia has collected a mountain of data for decades on different populations of whales. And so looking specifically at humpbacks here in the North Pacific from 2004 to 2007 was the SPLASH study. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. It was a very large collaborative effort. It's one of the largest collaborative efforts on whale populations ever. And it was really, really interesting, yielded a whole bunch of results and a whole bunch of data. And from that data, folks at Duke were able to look at the entanglement rates of humpback whales along the West Coast here. And what they found was that about 30 to 50% of the humpback whales from British Columbia down to Southern California showed entanglement scars, had been entangled at one point in their life. We don't know these populations of whales well enough, and we don't have such extensive coverage of these whales as they do on the East Coast and the Gulf of Maine to be able to look at year-to-year changes or mortality rates or things like that. But it's certainly the goal, and it's one of our, when we're out collecting our data, one of our main objectives is to get that tailstock photo. As you can see here, a few different examples of different tailstock photos that show evidence of entanglement scarring. And using all this data that we collect are other graduate students who are meticulously pouring through the photos and trying to understand how individual whales, and not only individual whales, but in specific locations along the West Coast, how do those locations change? Allison Payne is a master's student at San Francisco State University, and she's looking specifically at humpback whales that return to Central California and Northern California feeding grounds to see how that sort of subpopulation of humpback whales is impacted. Annabelle Wall is looking, she's studying more Monterey Bay specific entanglement reports and the scars of whales that are photographed in Monterey Bay, which has incredible coverage due to the high whale watching pressure that happens here. And so why do we spend so much time trying to know these whales as individual? And it is a lot of time. You need that good fluke shot of a whale to be able to identify it as an individual, and oftentimes they don't give you that fluke shot. But knowing them as an individual, we can say so much more about what happens to an entangled whale. We can really start to expand our knowledge, not only from the scar studies, but just from resites as well. And so this was a humpback whale entangled off northern Vancouver Island. It actually had become entangled twice in the span of 2 weeks. It got entangled and was reported. Somehow it freed itself. And then 2 weeks later, it showed up again and was entangled in a whole bunch of different gear. And this whale, a response team was sent out to free this whale after its second entanglement. They made some cuts, but there was still what was considered to be a life-threatening entanglement left on the whale, and they had to leave because light was getting low. And they went out the next day, searched for it, couldn't find it, and that was that. The only documentation they could get of its unique features was this dorsal fin photo and this teeny little sliver of a fluke. Which is really not great, not the best fluke shot for identifying as an individual. From that little sliver, though, they were able to match it to a cataloged whale from the Marine Education and Research Society, MERS, that they had photographed the year before in pretty much the exact same location that it had become entangled in. So they were able to match it. They went out the next day and they looked for it. They couldn't find it when it was still entangled. They had a few boats searching, couldn't find it, but they were able to at least identify it to an individual. Then the next year, Twister, which was the name of this entangled whale, was photographed in the exact same spot in Vancouver, up there and behind Vancouver Island, as where MERS first sighted it. And it's actually been photographed every single year since. It's been seen in 2019 and 2020 as well, back up in there behind Vancouver Island, returning to the same area to feed. And so we know that this whale, despite having a life-threatening entanglement and not being freed by an entanglement response team, was somehow able to survive. And so, you know, it's another piece of the puzzle and understanding what happens to entangled whales and how we can sort of combat this problem. But we need that baseline information of what, you know, that baseline information of who are you? And so that's a lot of what we do when we're out there on our boats. You can see, again, just examples of the different tail flukes we take and how unique they are for each animal. It's like a human fingerprint. And then the tail stock photos that we're trying to get. You can see here, this is me trying to take a picture of like 6 different whales as they're all fluking. And it is often very difficult to collect this data. And it's time consuming and it takes a lot of sort of effort. And so one of the things that we try to do is to do wide sweeps of the coast and cover a lot of ground as best we can. And so we do a coast-wide survey, essentially from Central California up to Washington, collecting data as we go. And this was from our 2020 survey. We're gearing up to do our 2021 survey, probably in the beginning of October, but we're not quite sure. The weather is always tough up there in the Pacific Northwest. But from these 14 days of surveys, we were able to collect this wealth of information about whales all along the coast that'll be used to further understand entanglements. 2020 was a really tough year, though, especially in this time period, as we all know, for the wildfire season was particularly difficult last year and has been tough this year as well. And so for most of our survey there off of Oregon and Washington, we were covered in smoke. This top left picture, you can see we're that red dot covered in a blanket of smoke. The coastline is in yellow there. But we were completely obscured by smoke. This humpback whale lunge feeding at the surface was only about 30 meters away from us, but you can barely see him because of how thick the smoke was. And at times the sky was even glowing orange, like you can see in the boat there. And so despite all those sort of hurdles, we were still able to collect a tremendous amount of data, I think. So we cited 363 humpback whales with 243 ID shots. And that was just for humpback whales. We had a number of blue whale and fin whale sightings and data collection pieces as well. But all things considered, we were able to collect a trove of information that'll sort of help us to understand some of these gaps in our knowledge about entanglements and how to prevent them. And so why do we disentangle whales? As I mentioned, it's dangerous. It takes a long time before you're permitted to do this. And it can be, and the question of why we do it should absolutely be one that's asked and addressed. And there's 3 sort of main reasons for why we do entanglement response. There's the welfare of the individual animal, as we talked about first. These individual, you know, it's often a long time to death, and it's often an agonizing death for these highly intelligent and highly social animals. It's certainly a welfare concern. There's a public safety concern as well, because these animals are massive and incredibly powerful. And not only that, an entangled whale by definition is an injured wild animal. It doesn't know that you're there to help it. It doesn't understand that you're it doesn't understand that you're trying to help. There have been a few stories of folks getting into the water with entangled whales and cutting them free and describing a mystical connection with the animal. And as lovely as that is and would be, it's incredibly dangerous to put yourself in that sort of position, not only from being struck by an injured wild animal, but there's always the risk of yourself becoming entangled in that gear that the whale is entangled in as well. And now you're attached to that entangled animal and the situation is dire. Our number one rule in the boat is to never ever, or on the entanglement response boat, is to never ever get in the water. It's the absolute last. It's not only the last, it's not even the last thing we do. We never do it. It's not an option. And the last sort of main reason for entanglement response is this conservation issue. And this one is especially important with species like the North Atlantic right whale, right, where there's estimated about 380 to 400 of those whales left in the Atlantic Ocean. You know, they suffered tremendous pressure from the whaling industry, hence their name, the right whale. It came from them being the right whale to hunt. And that's why the North Pacific right whale is essentially extinct at this point. There's about 30 estimated individuals left in the North Pacific right whale is essentially extinct with about 30 animals left. But there's still hope for the North Atlantic right whale if we can combat some of these entanglement issues and the ship strike issues. And like the example with wart I talked about earlier on, freeing just one entangled, reproductively viable female North Atlantic right whale can add calves to that population, which significantly, increases the chance that that species won't go extinct. And so a whale that's still in good health when it's disentangled has the same chance of survival as a whale that has never been entangled. And so this is what I mentioned earlier about the time to death for an entangled whale. It really does depend on the severity and the location of the entanglement. It also depends on how long it's been entangled. So this whale was a humpback whale that was first reported on December 12th, 2019. A team went out to look for it and couldn't find it on that day. But on December 13th, Marine Life Studies here out of Monterey Bay, was able to find it and report it to an entanglement team. And here in this image, Doug Sandilands is making the cut to free this humpback whale from its entanglement. And then nearly a year later, this humpback whale was seen completely gear-free and big, actually it was described as quite big and healthy and feeding off of San Francisco. And so this whale that was quickly reported, a response team was close by and ready to go. They freed this whale. It was like it never even happened, right? Which is the best case scenario for an entangled whale. So just a piece about the documentation part. In my opinion, this documentation aspect is the most important reason for why we do entanglement responses, because the information that we get from this documentation helps us to understand how and where this whale became entangled. If we can understand how and where the whale became entangled, we can start to design preventative solutions that will, exactly like they sound, prevent the whale from becoming entangled in the first place. Sarah mentioned that when she was talking, or when she was introducing me earlier, and I was thrilled to hear her emphasize that as one of the main points, because it really is, as we saw from the SCAR studies on the East Coast, only about 6% of the entanglements that happen get reported to their network, and they have the best network in the entire world. Of the people who do that, they have the best formed network, and they're only getting 6% of all the entanglements that happen reported to them. Doing entanglement response is not the solution to this problem. There's no way we're ever going to go have teams or have enough teams and enough people and enough folks on the water to report all the entanglements that are happening and then go out and successfully free these whales. Preventative solutions is the only way we're going to combat this issue and help these whales and prevent them from becoming prevent them from becoming entangled. But in order to design those solutions, we need more information. We just don't have enough information about where whales are becoming entangled here on the West Coast to start to address some of these issues. And so any documentation that we collect during this entanglement response, how it's wrapped around the whale, and then after we cut that gear free, taking that gear back with us and understanding things like the breaking strength of line, how different parts of the body get wrapped up in line, and how line moves across the body are all really key parts of information that will help us design some solutions. And so you can see from this map, these sort of shaded regions show the area that different entanglement response teams cover. And this is, just for the just for North America, we have pretty good coverage, or there's teams everywhere that are trained and have the tools and are sort of ready to go. But it also just speaks to how widespread this problem is. You know, anywhere that whales are in the ocean, there's a chance that you'll find an entangled one. So it's necessary to have these teams all across the country. So the IWC has put a ton of effort and funds into helping these teams spread out. You know, you could see from that previous map that there were teams in Mexico, America, and Canada. And, you know, they're able to work together and collaborate and train together and share information because of the IWC and all the help and support that the IWC gives whale entanglement response teams. They fund this expert advisory panel every year to connect people and expert entanglement responders from all over the world so that they can get together and discuss this issue. And quickly, I just want to run through some common misconceptions about whale entanglements, just some key takeaways that I hope that at the least you'll remember these things from this presentation. So the whale is always in immediate danger is a very common misconception. Very rarely is the whale in immediate danger. On the left here was the first whale that the Center for Coastal Studies ever disentangled. And there was about 3 to 4 months in between its initial reporting as being entangled and when it was finally cut free. On the right is a minke whale that was anchored in place for several days off of Massachusetts. And even though it was anchored in place, it was still able to get to the surface to take a breath. And so it was essentially, you know, it was for the most part fine. It could stay in place and it could breathe. It had everything it needed immediately. And so there was no need for you know, someone who came across that whale to panic and try to help it immediately. There's time to form a plan and to get trained responders out to a whale almost always. Another common misconception, as I mentioned, you must get in the water, and no, our number one rule is to never ever get in the water. From about 60 attempts that we've been able to document by untrained members of the public, there's been 1 or 2 deaths. There's unclear. There's been several injuries. I witnessed an injury of someone off the coast of Southwest Africa trying to help an entangled humpback whale, and their leg was broken by the pectoral flipper of the whale because they insisted on getting in the water near it. And there's been even more close calls. Even among trained entanglement responders, there's close calls and there's injuries. But our number one rule across the entire world, enforced by the IWC, is to never, ever get in the water. It's the most dangerous place to be around an entangled whale. From over 2,000 whales that have been disentangled by these professional teams trained by the IWC and permitted, there's been 2 non-life-threatening injuries, and there was 1 death in 2017 by a man who had been doing entanglement response for several decades. He had an incredible amount of experience, and he made a final cut on an entangled right whale and cut the whale free. And the whale's tail Fluke flipped up, bent into the boat, and struck him, and he actually passed away from his injuries. To disentangle a right whale requires level 5 entanglement response authorization by NOAA, and it's the highest level that you can essentially rise to. The only difference between level 4 and level 5 responders is the ability to work on right whales specifically, because right whales are incredibly flexible and incredibly I shouldn't say dangerous. All of these whales are dangerous, but right whales in particularly react very aggressively to entanglement response. And so having experience around right whales specifically is critical to any time you participate in a right whale entanglement. Another common misconception is that cutting the trailing gear, all that rope that's dragging behind the whale, is actually helping the whale. And this is not the case at all. It actually makes it incredibly harder for a trained response team to get out there and to grapple onto that gear and try to free it. You can think about it as like a dog that's broken free, right? If it only has its collar on, all you have to grab onto it is its collar as it runs around or something like that. But if its collar is trailing a leash, then you can just grab the leash and then you're attached to that dog. And it's sort of the same thing with an entanglement. If there's line trailing behind the whale, we can grapple onto that line or pick up that line and start to work our way towards the whale. But if it's just tight line wrapped around the body, it's really, really difficult for us to help that animal. And again, sorry, this was a North Atlantic right whale where the trailing gear had been cut off, and entanglement responders couldn't get any sort of secure attachment to this piece, the piece of line that was tightly wrapped around the left pectoral fin, and it ended up causing a deep infection and necrosis, and the whale passed away from that infection. And again, to emphasize, whales are not gentle giants. They're wild, they're the largest wild animals that we have on this planet, and they're injured, they're hurt. By definition, they've been dealing with their entanglement at least for a little while, and they're not happy about it. So anytime you make an approach, you really need to be aware of their behavior, and subtle changes in their behavior need to be picked up upon, or else the situation can become really dangerous really fast. That's supposed to be a video, but it's not working. And so there are these three pillars of understanding entanglement. And I've talked about population studies, and I've talked about why we do entanglement response. And I just wanted to talk briefly about the stranding response element of understanding entanglements and sort of the information we get from that. And so just the documentation alone that's come from stranded, either live stranded or dead stranded entangled whales has produced several publications that help us understand how line wraps around animals and where in the water column whales become entangled. And specifically here on the West Coast, there have been a few cases that have been really informative into understanding specifically how that case happened. There was this live stranded humpback off of Eureka, California in 2019 that washed up with this big jumble of line coming through its mouth and wrapping around its pectoral flipper there. And the whale actually passed away on the beach. But from the documentation, the amazing documentation that we were able to get from that stranding response, we were able to recreate exactly how the entanglement wrapped around the whale. And by using some of the identifying features that were left on the line, you're able to tell what was attached or where that line would have been attached to the pot. And from that information, we can tell where in the water column roughly the whale must have been swimming in order for it to become entangled. And whales never, humpback whales at least, never swim with their mouth open unless they're lunge feeding. And so if we looked at the pictures, we could see that there was line in the mouth. And so we know that its mouth, it must have been feeding, actively feeding when it became entangled in this line. And so information like that becomes really critical to understanding specific entanglement cases. And all, as I've mentioned, the documentation and the information that we pull from each case is going to lead to these preventative solutions that will ultimately help. And again, stranding response provides documentation of individual cases that just add to our not only to our understanding, but to our overall knowledge base about the problem. These were two cases that were part of our 2020 total confirmed cases of entanglements. On the left, this is a humpback whale's fluke it's the tail stalk. The fluke has been completely severed from a previous entanglement. It's not 100% confirmed if the severing, was from an entanglement wound, but experts who reviewed the wound strongly suggest that it was. And then this humpback whale on the right is essentially it's a slightly earlier stage of the humpback whale on the left. Its fluke is still attached, but that entanglement caused severe necrosis of the tissue, and its fluke is essentially just dead and still barely attached to the animal. And another key piece that I'd be remiss to not mention before the end of this presentation is the importance of working with fishermen. As I mentioned, whales are mostly becoming entangled in active fishing gear. And so coming up with alternative fishing solutions seems to be the best preventative solution that we have right now for combating entanglements. But it's really, really difficult to come up with effective solutions or alternative fishing methods that don't completely bankrupt fishermen or just completely put them out of a job. There have been various techniques that have been proposed and tested. One here is it's called a Yale grip or a weak link, and it's essentially just like a Chinese finger trap in the line where if a whale becomes entangled, that's going to be the breaking point of that line. And if there's less gear attached to the whale, there's a higher chance that it will be able to free itself from its entanglement. But there's many other solutions that have been tested, like ropeless gear on the East Coast and the West Coast, which uses acoustic releases to keep all of the gear sort of contained on the bottom, and a signal lets that device know when to release the gear and the lines back up to the surface. But there's still a lot of hurdles sort of to overcome with a lot of these alternative technologies. And so working with fishermen, we need fishermen's expertise on the water and their incredible knowledge about how to fish and the intricacies of the ocean to sort of understand how we're going to be able to still fish and still provide food for local communities and global communities, and prevent whales from becoming entangled. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And so what you guys can do, not only on your stranding responses, of course, document, or on your beach walks, document any potential stranding or entanglement wound or resulting stranding from an entanglement that you come across, but you can also look for entangled whales. Absolutely. Often on the California coast here, entangled whales are spotted from the bluff. Most often they're gray whales, but any sort of place you can get a good vantage point and look down on the ocean, there's a chance you're going to see an entangled whale. If you do, you can report it immediately to this number, 1-877-SOS whale, or the real numbers, 767-9425. I'll make sure that number is shared with you all after this too. So if you don't get it down right now, don't worry. And then standing by and documenting are two critical pieces of this as well. And I'll talk about them really quickly as well. But this is when you call that number, you don't have to worry about all this information and remembering it now, because when you call that number, there'll be a trained responder on the other end of the line who will walk you through this list of questions and ask you all these details about the entangled whale, so that we can understand it and relay that information to the nearest entanglement response team and try to get them out on the water. But standing by is critical. So anyone with a boat, if you're ever out on the water and you come across an entangled whale, the biggest thing you can do to help is just standing by and updating people on its location. Because the more time that whale has to swim freely, the larger our search area gets, and it increases exponentially with time. So if 2 hours go by between sightings of that entangled whale, we have over 450 square nautical miles to cover, and it's just an impossible feat to find that whale again. And that's something that we ran into really commonly here over the last year and a half, is we had difficulty getting a standby vessel. And if we don't get a standby, the chances that we get the response team out there are very slim. Some key notes though about standing by: give the whale space. They'll be moving slowly, likely because they're entangled and injured and they're trying to take it calm. So don't approach too closely, because your vessel can become entangled in the gear trailing behind the whale. And that's really bad for you, for your boat, and for the whale. Additionally, if you're approaching closely to the whale, you'll likely agitate it. And so that when a response team gets out there, it's going to be really difficult for them to safely approach that animal and try to cut it free. The documentation while standing by: you can never take enough pictures, is our sort of motto. I mentioned this picture in the top left. It was from a whale watching boat, and it almost wasn't caught. That was a confirmed report that almost slipped through the cracks. And it just sort of goes to show how important documentation is and how difficult it can be to sometimes spot these entanglements out there in person. So if you ever do come across an entangled whale, take as many pictures as your memory card will allow you to. Any information that we can gather about the nature of that entanglement will help the disentanglement team be able to better prepare and game plan for how they're going to help that animal. Thank you guys very much. That ran a little bit longer than I wanted it to, and I apologize for keeping you for an hour. I really appreciate it though. This is a really important issue that I'm sure you're all aware of how important this is and how gruesome it is for an entangled whale to die. And so I appreciate the opportunity to come out here and sort of talk about it with like-minded individuals. So thank you guys very much. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm going to stop sharing so I can at least see people, because I can't see anything.
Nice, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jack. And I had hoped that we might have some of our local fishermen pop on We do have a vessel in the Noyo harbor a vessel or two that are pretty willing to do that standby. So if we were to see a whale that was entangled, that we could report the SOS whale. And then what we would do is we have to start getting stuff going. We would put in the calls and then hopefully get Sean in the Telstars willing to go out, and who knows who else. And we have a wonderful new harbor master here who hopefully made it on as well, and getting the Noyo harbor, because again, we are just this, Fort Bragg is just kind of 3 hours north of San Francisco in that rescue boat, and 3 hours south of the other one, up in Eureka and whatnot. So we're kind of out there, but we could really, really be of help if we were able to report an entangled whale and keep track and kind of watch it and see which direction it's going and all. But the first thing is to call that number. Don't call me, don't call the Mammal Center, call the SOS whale. Critical. And then, like Jack was saying, you can just, they'll take you through this little bunches of questions. Yeah, so I think if people want to ask questions, that is absolutely fine. For those of you who want to pop off right now, feel free. I know we've taken up a while in your evening, but if it's all right with Jack, we can maybe just stay tuned here and get into a discussion. I know at least one of those pictures there that Jack showed was a humpback whale from Manchester Beach, and that was our response team that went down and responded to that whale and took a ton of pictures, and it had some other line scars and whatnot. But we've actually had 2 flukeless whales that have stranded here in the Fort Bragg area. And then of course our orca, we all know that orca story, which was he became entangled, and we had the gear that told the story, and he was first seen in Westport with that gear on him, and then he washed in Fort Bragg in 2015. So he was one of those statistics in that year of high entanglement, and it was crab pot, as we know. So it happens, and I've seen a humpback trailing gear off of Fort Bragg at one point. So keeping a sharp eye out for that stuff and reporting it is the best thing possible. And then working with our harbor and working with our fleet of fisher people. I know there's plenty of people that really want to help us out, which is super exciting. And yeah, so if people have questions, I think just go ahead and chime in. I think Trey will be able to unmute folks.
Sue, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, hi, Jack. I work with the Noyo Center. I'm the education program coordinator. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for a articulate and descriptive and multi-leveled talk. And I just appreciate the work you do. And I just was curious, you could share how you got interested in what you do, period, whether your connection to the ocean, just on a, that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love to know. So.
Thank you very much for the kind words. I appreciate it. Public speaking, even though it's Zoom, I still get a little nervous in talking in front of people. So I appreciate it. So I actually, I had a sort of strange path to get here. And I grew up in Boston on the Neponset River, and I like to fish the striped bass run into the Neponset River at the start of the summer and the end of the summer. And I always loved the ocean. But I never, realized it was a career option to study marine life. So I was interested in economics when I went to college. At first, I was like, I think you can make money doing that, so I'll try that. And I did that for about a semester, and I hated it. And I realized that, I needed to do something I liked. So I switched to environmental science, and I got an internship actually out in Southwest Africa in Namibia, working with a research team that studied marine mammals. And we actually, I worked with a group of, it was sort of, there's different regulations over there. And so we didn't need permits to respond to entangled pinnipeds. And they have the largest Cape fur seal colony in the world there over in Namibia. And they have a really high entanglement rate as well. And so I was there for 3 months, and we disentangled about 300 and something Cape fur seals. And actually the majority of that was active fishing gear. It was snook line that fishermen used, but there was a considerable amount of marine debris too. It was almost 50-50. But that sort of process, really opened my eyes to oh, okay, these animals are incredible. We need to do a little bit better job of taking care of them. And so from there, I was just sort of snatching up opportunities left and right. And I've been fortunate to travel a lot and go a lot of different places and work in some cool environments. And that has been motivating as well.
Well, thank you for the work you do and doing a talk and sharing
Thanks,
all your information.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions for Jack? Feel free to chime in.
I have a question.
Great.
Yeah, fire away.
I don't believe you told us what the exact techniques that you used for freeing these critters. We saw that X thing. What other techniques do you use?
It's a great question. And I actually cut those slides because I was trying to keep my time to 45 minutes and I didn't even come close. So maybe I should have kept them and we could have done another 5 minutes. So essentially there is a set of tools that we use, but since every entanglement is different in like the severity and the location on the animal, there's no one set approach. But we have a set of tools that we walk through that we use on every response. And so one tool that we use the most is our grapple. We have a grapple that's attached to usually 60 feet of line. Actually, I have one around here somewhere, but it's just a standard, 4-prong grapple attached to 60 feet of line and a big marker buoy. And we throw that grapple over any trailing gear that we can find. And that's why it's so important that, folks on the water don't cut off that trailing gear. So we have something to grapple onto. Once we snug our grapple on and that 60 feet of line is attached to one buoy, we start adding buoys to that grapple line, essentially kegging buoys. The techniques are based off of old whaling techniques, actually, how folks out of Nantucket, exactly, close to where the Center for Coastal Studies is, how the folks out of Nantucket used to hunt whales. The Nantucket sleigh ride is how when they would harpoon a whale, that whale would take off. We do sort of the same procedure where we grapple into the entangling gear, we attach floats, and then we bend that line over the bow of our small inflatable boat and we go for a Nantucket sleigh ride. The whale we slowly move those buoys closer and closer to the whale while staying careful and stuff like that. But as we move those buoys closer, it becomes harder for the whale to dive down and it's more tired. And once each response, usually the minimum amount of time is 6 hours because it takes a long time for the whale to tire down until it's safe enough to make an approach. And then we attach a knife. We have many different kinds of knives for different sort of entanglements. There's a different blade for a deeply entangled wound versus versus a line in the mouth versus a line over the flippers. But all of those knives get attached to the end of a 30-foot pole. And like in some of those images, you probably saw Doug holding that pole and trying to place the knife. It requires a tremendous amount of practice and maneuvering, especially when you're on the water in an inflatable boat with a sharp knife. Things can easily go wrong. And so once that 30-foot pole is taken out, things become very cautious and very careful because it can get really dangerous really quickly. We also have different kinds of poles. There's flexible poles, there's rigid poles, there's solid aluminum versus carbon fiber, all sort of decisions that we make in the field as we're assessing the whale, its behavior, the nature of the entanglement. Those approaches would be great for a whale that's free swimming, but for a whale that's anchored and has all of the entangling gear hanging down from below it, it's really hard to grapple onto it because there's no trailing gear. So we have to usually come up with alternative methods to get at that entangling gear that's keeping the whale, anchored in place. So it's tough to sort of describe one unique approach or one approach to entangling a whale because there isn't one approach. Really, we have a set of tools. And then through, the experience of these entanglement responders, they decide the best course of action to take from freeing that whale. But the number one rule is to never get in the water. That's the main thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
What % of the entanglements are from fishing versus other? Seems like a pretty high %, huh?
Yeah, it's tough to sort of group it into one category. Commercial fishing regulations here on the West Coast have since 2014 have required commercial fishermen, trap and net fishermen, to mark their gear with identifying features so that we can tell which fishery it's coming from and which stretch of coastline it's coming from. Unfortunately, there's no regulations for recreational gear, or I'm sorry, very recently, I think only a year or two ago, regulations for recreational gear started coming out to mark that. So sort of on the West Coast, we have a really poor data pool to pull from. We only have a couple years of information to start to look at where these entanglements are coming from. I showed that one figure, that pie chart from 3 years of data, or 3 years of entanglements, the most entanglements on the West Coast, and 33% of it was Dungeness crab gear. And so that has gotten a lot of flack sort of in the media and I shouldn't say flack, it's gotten a lot of attention from researchers and from the media. But we can't be 100% sure that Dungeness crab is the most the most damaging fishery. One thing that we can look at again is the East Coast, and where they have great amounts of data. They know that the lobster fisheries over there off of Massachusetts and Maine, New Hampshire, up into Nova Scotia, are a large source of entanglements for whales over there. And so certainly the source of entanglements on the East Coast is dominated by this active fishing gear and lobster fisheries in particular. Whereas over here, it does seem to be Dungeness crab. But again, I want to emphasize how small our data pool is and how much more research needs to be done on that exact question here for the West Coast. So I know that's not a great answer, but
well, is there ever any penalty to these if you can identify where it came from? Is there anything legally,
Right. No, there's not. And actually, there's the opposite. There's incentives for fishermen to self-report. If they know that a whale has become entangled in their gear, there's incentives for that fisherman to self-report. And the incentive is that I think NOAA will, pay for the cost of replacing that gear that whale has become entangled in. And that's because one, we want fishermen, we want everyone working together. Fishermen are a great resource for helping address this problem. And fishermen certainly don't want whales entangled in their gear. One, it's really pricey and expensive for them to have to replace their gear. Two, they don't want to see these large creatures entangled and hurt and dying. One, from like a welfare perspective, and two, from a business perspective, as whales are a critical part of the stable marine ecosystem. And so a loss of whales is going to be harmful to the fishermen and their catches. Lastly, it's not their fault. If a whale becomes entangled in their gear, at the end of the day, it's not their fault. They didn't put that trap out there intentionally trying to catch a whale. They're probably trying to catch crab or fish or something else, and a whale happened to swim into their gear. So yeah.
That's, in fact, when we respond and we do have an entanglement issue, we obscure the numbers on the gear, because we're not pointing fingers at the individual. And with our orca, heaven knows that guy did not want to catch an orca at all.
Right.
And it had to be a really sad and horrific kind of experience for him, just like for the researchers that hit the blue whale. It's not something that they want to do. They're out on the ocean oftentimes because they do love the ocean and they like to be out at sea. So yeah, that's an important take home there. And Leah was just wondering, how often are you successful in your attempts? I think you talked a little bit about that, but like that's a
Not
big
very.
question.
Here on the West Coast, I think we are, it's between five, it's been since 2014. I think it's been an 11% success rate of confirmed reports. And, you can compare that to the over 50% success rate that the Center for Coastal Studies has had for now over 20 years. We don't have as great an established network here on the West Coast yet. And not only that, but the Pacific Ocean and the West Coast is very, very different than the Atlantic Ocean and the East Coast and Cape Cod Bay, which is pretty protected by Cape Cod. They have time to go out, or time and good weather to go out on these responses, where we don't have that sort of fortunate atmosphere here on the West Coast. So about, I believe the 2020 entanglement reports came out a few months ago, and from compiling all that data since 2014, I'm pretty sure the successful disentanglement response rate is about 11% on the West Coast.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. That
Thank
was
you.
great.
Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Great
All
question.
right.
Take good care.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.